Same question I put to the trade union representatives, and that is just to get a broad sense of where you see things are on a scale of 1 to 10. How close do you think we are to getting a resolution to this? 1 being nowhere near, 10 being very close.
I think the challenge is depending what trade union you're speaking about. So if I take the 3 trade unions that were represented earlier, RMT, I believe that we have an opportunity to try and move forward. So I think we're within reasonable areas of where I think we can get a deal, but we have to work through it with them. Obviously, as it was indicated, there's further discussions tomorrow. So obviously we wait and see the outcome of that. TSSA in a very similar position where we've got further discussions tomorrow. ASLEF is slightly different, where we have been further behind with ASLEF. Obviously we made the offer last Friday. We've heard the reaction of ASLEF. We need to do more work with them and try and get back round the table. So that one is probably further behind the other 2 at this moment in time.
Thank you. I'll come back on the ASLEF point in a moment, but Tim, firstly, where do you see things from Network Wales' perspective?
Yes, there has been further progress, and of course in December we made the revised offer. So unfortunately, a 10 for the TSSA and Unite, which are part of the same negotiating group, because they're resolved, and that's good news. And then those members of staff have now had that money for the controllers grade group, and as soon as we can resolve with RMT, then then that will resolve those 2 unions. For RMT, 36% of their members that are Network Rail employees voted yes for the deal. So we're a bit short of the 50% that we need. There's a couple of thousand people that need to change their vote. So we met again with the RMT leadership yesterday for discussions, and we're planning to meet again next week. I'd place that as 7.
You're more optimistic than we've just heard from the trade unions that this can be resolved.
Well, particularly for the Network Rail disputes with the RMT, because that's the only one that's outstanding from our perspective, then yes, and I base that on the fact that say 36% of Network Rail members of the RMT voted yes for the deal. So we only need another, 2 and a bit at achieving that.
For those people that you want to persuade to accept the offer, is that across the board of the union members, or are they in one particular sector of the industry?
Yeah, so this is absolutely within the Network Rail part of the population of RMT membership, and there are some specific areas of the deal that we're going to focus on, and where we know during the referendum that took place in December, because that referendum happened quite quickly, there are some quite complex parts to this deal. It does achieve quite substantial change.
Last week, which you've heard this morning and in the press, has provoked quite an angry reaction. Can you just talk me through why you put out the offer in this way, and perhaps in the expectation that the reaction would be what it's been?
Yeah, the situation with ASLEF, as I indicated earlier, it's not moved along as quickly as we would want it to, and that's been people's availability, those type of things. The negotiating teams have been speaking to ASLEF, they've made themselves available at certain times, but what's been quite clear through it is trying to put something down on paper to describe the wider areas of reform that we require. So on the enabling framework agreement that we started off with at the beginning had a number of reform areas that we looked at. And when we talk about the 2 billion industry shortfall, when the pandemic struck, revenues obviously fell to as low as 5%. They've recovered roughly into the area about 80%. So that's a £2 billion shortfall in what we would normally expect to see in revenue for the industry. So we worked with the trade unions on how could the industry help meet that shortfall, work together, and looking at areas of where we can self-help. So areas of reform, workforce being part of that area, and there's other areas outside of that, of where, looking at different capitalisation of projects, these type of things. So that's what we've been trying to work with the trade unions. Those discussions have moved at various paces. RMT probably have been more engaged in some of the negotiations. He was looking to try and have a further meeting with the Minister I then tried to speak to him last week to turn around and say, look, can I have a morning to again update him on I was going to issue something. Unfortunately, he was tied up in meetings that day, and we left it to as late in the day as we could within office hours, and then we put the offer out at 3:15 in the afternoon.
So it's fair to say that you've made reasonable efforts to engage with ASLEF throughout this, and the offer that you put out on Friday late afternoon was, I don't want to say point of exasperation, but
I wouldn't say it was a point of exasperation. I think it was to try and lay out all the areas of reform that we were needing to do and put everything in one document that we could then allow us to use that document to move forward and, as a negotiation. And that's what myself and the trade unions and Tim and the trade unions try to do, is have that negotiation so that we can try and flush out the areas of where we're in agreement or disagreement, and then try to work forward with that so that we can get some form of settlement to get this dispute off the table.
So, having listened to what they said earlier in this session, what's your next move to try and engage with ASLEF to?
Well, I think Mr. Whelan alluded that he has gone back to his board, his exec committee. They will look at that document, or maybe not a response, but they will come back in some shape or form. I would surmise that they will then turn around and say whether it's accepted, that we have a further discussion with ASLEF so that we can try and get through the document in more detail and then try and work to a solution to it.
I think I'm quoting him accurately when he said there wasn't one line in it that he could possibly accept. That doesn't sound terribly hopeful. So if that is their reaction when they've spoken to their executive, what comes next?
Well, again, I think they have to take railway, and that's what we're trying to work with. And it makes us more confident and rest day working in these type of areas. So that makes the railway better. We can deliver that service for customers who, let's be fair, through all this process have the big people who've been most affected. And obviously then staff impacted on the strike action. So we've got to work together to try and resolve this.
Thank you. That's my questions for now. Turn next to Jack.
Thank you, Chair. And my questions are predominantly for Mr Montgomery. And in terms of making an improved offer to RMT and TSSA, what is that improved offer? Are you planning to make an improved offer to them?
Obviously, it's a negotiation. And it's confidential at this moment in time, so I wouldn't like to talk about what we're going to discuss tomorrow. I don't think that's respectful to the trade unions and no disrespect to the committee, but you would understand my position. I think it's important that we have that discussion with the trade unions tomorrow and try and see if we can get common ground and move forward with the deal.
What is your understanding of where that common ground might be and how you can move these negotiations forward?
Again, I would rather take that and discuss that with the trade unions rather than debate it in the room here.
Okay. In terms of the ASLEF union, obviously we heard earlier and we heard from a representative from Mick Lynch, and he basically said that he doesn't even recognise your existence and the existence of all.
I think the language is something we have worked very closely with They use myself as the chair of RDG to sit in RIRG, all these acronyms, to try and help facilitate important forum. And we've tried to continue that forum to then lead into the pay discussions that we've had and looking at taking the where, we just have to get more time in the room and try and work through the detail and a bit more. And I think ASLEF are I think why we put the document out helps that situation, that it's more open and everybody then sees that key areas of where we believe reform can help drive the funding that we then need to give to our staff a pay increase. So it's important that we get up
to move
tomorrow, and TSSA tomorrow, I think that we can move forward quickly. But I do accept that there's a number of challenges in
well, we heard from Mr Lynch his potentially. Are you going to allow it to go on that long?
Certainly we don't want to. We have been quite clear we want to try and get resolvement of these disputes. It does take both parties. We want to sit down with RMT, TSSA and ASLEF to try and resolve this as quickly as we can. And short of strikes where people don't become available to cover turns at short notice, these things are all impacting, and customers are starting to use other modes of transport. So we've got to sit with the trade unions, we've got to try and get ourselves sorted out so that we can then start to provide a service for customers. So that's really important. That's where Tim, are really focused on, is getting the dispute resolved as quickly as we can so that we can then restore the services.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Graham.
Thanks very much, Chair. So some of the areas we've already covered. Good morning, gentlemen.
Morning.
But just to in relation to the ASLEF offer, I think you were in for the earlier session. But, in relation to the offer that was made on the Friday, Mick Whelan did explain to the committee, because of the fragmented nature of the rail industry, he's dealing with various bargaining units in Scotland, in Wales, Merseyrail, and so on. So I think it's understandable. 1538, I think he said.
18.
Sorry, 32.
18.
15. He did make a comment that he thought it had undermined good faith in the process to make that offer directly to the members. So it's just to point that out. But given that you were in agreement with the £2 billion figure that I think that Mick Lynch, well, in fact the whole panel agreed with, in terms of reducing costs, I wonder if you would give the committee some insight as to how the modelling works. For example, the plan to close the ticket offices. I don't know if that's Mr. Shoveler's area really. How much saving would that bring about? Some of the other elements, there's a lot of talk about. I've heard Mr. Shoveler on the TV talking about the need to improve safety and to have workers not exposed to risk and so on. But some of the new technologies, driver-only operation, will surely require significant investment in signalling and so on. So how does the cost modelling reflect in this £2 billion worth of savings?
Again, without getting into the mega detail of it all, so the workforce reform, Mary, that then has to be submitted to the DFT, and somebody has to opine on whether that booking office can close or whether we can reduce the hours on it. And that's how the process works at this moment. So until you get through that whole process, you don't actually know how much money you could potentially save. But again, just to be clear, in a lot of booking offices, we are not talking about unstaffing stations. This is one point we need to be quite clear. It's about moving people from out behind the ticket office window onto platforms, able to give a greater service, hopefully, to customers. But, where you want to make sure that people are there to deal with more vulnerable individuals, those individuals who we take out from behind the glass can sell the same types of tickets via the ticket vending machines, or they can help customers get a ticket if it's a unique thing, which is about 1% of tickets. If it's something unique, they can help the customer out. But when they're out from behind the glass, if they see a vulnerable individual, somebody, they are there then, rather than in behind the glass.
I understand that. But surely there must be some...
Yeah, I think the figure is that we mention in documentation.
I understand that the trade unions have submitted a complaint to the Central Arbitration Committee on the grounds that you're refusing to disclose information that relates to the modelling of costs, not just in relation to ticket offices, but in relation to the anticipated cost reductions of driver-only operation as well. How are you responding to that?
We're dealing with it at this current time. It's obviously something it's live, so we are dealing with it at this moment in time.
We've heard from the trade unions previously, and indeed we've got the Rail Minister coming next week, but we had the Secretary of State giving evidence to the committee, and he's been quite definite, and he said, he told the committee on the 21st of December, I'm encouraging the trade unions and employers to get round the table, hammer out that deal on workforce reform, which delivers some of the financial savings that can help make a better pay offer. Now, we've heard that really your hands are tied through the mandate and the contract. So what kind of interaction are you having with the Secretary of State in relation to the preconditions that are being placed on you?
So obviously government have the overall funding of the industry. The contracts that are now set up, particularly for train operating companies, we are very much relying and going back to government, and as it was alluded to earlier on, we have to ensure that we seek permission before we were to do anything, or it becomes what they call a disallowable cost. But that's why myself and the negotiating team for the train operating companies, we're trying to do this centralised framework agreement so that we can then go to government and say, look, we believe that we've negotiated these areas of reform, we believe it could be worth X, Y and Z, and we believe this could result in a pay increase of whatever that pay increase is, and we want to be able to offer that to the trade unions, and that is obviously put in and submitted to the DFT, and then either people believe that that is the case, and obviously people have to check these things, and we will get a mandate back on what we believe is a sensible offer.
I just want to put something, I'm grateful for that response. I just want to put something to you, just from previous evidence sessions, when we've had other train operators, notably Northern Rail, who were the principal operator in my area, and indeed Avanti, and when we've asked them about their view on driver-only operation, particularly for Northern Rail, where many of the stations, including those in my constituency, are unmanned, it isn't something that they think is either desirable or that the network is currently to this precondition on accepting driver-only operation, or is this something that's been specified by the Secretary of State and the DFT?
So the driver-only operation, a driver-controlled operation, is something that we have been speaking to the trade unions about for many, many years, as you know. There is approximately 45% of services that currently operate driver-only operation. At Waterloo, we're bringing new trains in into, potentially into South Western Railways. If we have driver-only operation, or driver-controlled operation, can we get trains out more punctual, more reliable? If there's disruption in the network and the guard that's coming in has been delayed, could we put that train out on time and get the guard to join the train at another point? And that's the type of areas, that flexibility that we're trying to do. But that can only happen where the infrastructure and the trains are able to cope with that. And the industry across a lot of the network is not in that shape yet, because the trains are not capable of doing it. So it's only where the trains and the infrastructure that we will then use that type of equipment.
I might say my last experience, which was last Friday on the Lumo train from Newcastle, it was late 2.5 hours because of camera failures on the train. I'll hand my chair.
Okay, thank you. Chris?
Yeah, thank you, Jem. Good morning, Steve, and Tim, nice to see you. Steve, I just wanted to briefly ask you about the DOO-DCO point, and I'm going to move on to Tim to talk about the RMT negotiations. Just so we're clear on the whole sort of DOO proposition, what sort of percentage? There's a lot of concern, I think it's fair to say, that from members of the public, borne by what they've heard from what the unions have had to say, that there is a proposal to make the entire railway DOO. Now, I think hearing from what you've just had to say, that is absolutely not the case. Conversations you're having about it, and maybe what sort of percent.
Where we're looking at the moment is, and again, just to be clear, even any of the proposals or the thinking is, and certainly in a lot of routes, is not to have only a driver on the train. We always see in a lot of occasions where we would see a second person for customer service revenue protection. So it's not to take people off the train fully. It's about punctuality, reliability. The trains themselves, the only way that you can move this forward, do the trains, are they fitted to be able to operate with cameras so that the driver can see all the doors? Yeah. So at the moment, and I don't have the exact figure, Chris, but at the moment there's a number of trains in service that we could probably use more effectively. If future trains are ordered in with that type of equipment and the infrastructure is capable of coping with that, then we would like to use that again to drive punctuality and reliability. It has been proven that with the driver opening and closing the doors, it saves the on-train person having to run away for a customer to go and operate the doors.
So, for example, the lines and trains, take the Waterloo-Weymouth structure, does not exist. There is...
That are not equipped to be able to do that at this moment in time.
Yeah, thank you very much. Tim, can I come to you next?
Just add something there. I just want to be clear, because you've told my colleague there, Mr. Loader, that there's no plan to do it on every train. But yet the proposal actually says that the driver-only operation will be the default mode on every train. That's the proposal you're giving to the train.
Sorry, where the train is equipped to be able to do it. There's a lot of trains that are not equipped to be able to do driver-only operation.
And is there that qualification in the agreement?
Yeah, and what we are saying is, clearly the trade unions understand that where there is a train, a train that was built, I don't know, let's call it in 2000, it doesn't have the cameras fitted. No. You go and spend a lot of money and convert the train. But in these circumstances, what we're saying is, where the trains are currently equipped to be able to do that, or there is new trains brought into service, then we would look to try and use that facility on the train, and again to drive punctuality and reliability.
That's reflected in the agreement, or in the proposal?
They understand.
Thank you. Tim, I just wanted to come back to you to ask if you could give us a sort of an update from your perspective, please, on the...
Met yesterday with the leadership of the RMT, Mr Lynch and Mr Dempsey, and we were having discussions because the offer that we made in December was a substantial offer, and as I mentioned earlier, has been accepted by 2 of the 3 trade unions. So we wanted to hear from the leadership of the RMT their views on why the RMT have been unable to support and recommend the deal, as we'd hoped they would have done when we made the offer in December, and they sent it out with a recommendation to the members to reject the deal, which we know caused some people to vote no, and to understand any other details that they particularly wanted to feed back on that have been causing concern, to make sure that both represent. So what we'd like to do is really understand, and we have been doing that over this Christmas period, and again hearing from the union yesterday, which are those areas that we should now specifically go back to provide further discussion and confidence for our employees, with the objective of being able to have a further referendum at the right moment.
Do you have any insights currently as to what those specific remaining issues are that require resolution?
Yes, I do. I think there are 2 or 3 areas that have become very clear, based on the feedback we've had from employers, to target very clearly that the union have asked for, like a guarantee around no compulsory redundancies till January 2025, and of course the discounted rail travel for the employee and their dependents, which again is something the union have been asking for a long time. So there's as well as the cash, there's a number of other elements to this deal which we think recognise the challenging environment that we're in, recognise the economic circuit.
Earlier about how rock solid his members were in the strikes over the last 5-6 weeks or so. I just wondered if you had any insights or observations that you might be able to offer.
For a very long period of time, but we have absolutely seen in the last set of strikes, those just before and then especially after Christmas, that there has been a return to work by a number of employees, both in maintenance and operations. It's very localised. It tends to be groups of people that will come back in rather than individuals on their own. But nevertheless, yes, there's clearly a pattern of that we can see emerging.
And would you say that some employees who are also members of the RMT...
I'm perpetually optimistic, because in doing these type of roles we have to, despite all of the challenges, we have to keep searching repeatedly for an area where we have alignment, where we have something that we can build on. And I think this is a particular area now that, yes, it's quite clear that from the discussions that I have when I go around talking to my team, to my staff, what I see from my email inbox and contacts that I receive, that yes, there was a general feeling from a lot of people that before Christmas the referenda was too short, didn't allow people time to ask the questions they had, and yeah, I think those employees that have come back into work, obviously that's been a substantial thing for those groups. It's not done lightly, and it's not the way that we want to resolve the dispute either. It's not. We didn't set out to symptoms that people have, so we can find a way of resolving it.
Thank you. And just finally, Tim, from me, it's clear that you've made a lot of progress and indeed resolved the dispute with the TSSA and Unite in terms of the Network Rails relationship. I just wondered if you would like to briefly share any insights as to why it may have been quicker or easier to come to a settlement with those unions rather than, as you're finding it, you haven't come to that conclusion at the moment with the RMT.
Yes, I mean, there's no doubt that the fact that the TSSA, for example, recommended to its members to vote yes for the deal helped, because of course a lot of, I really feel for our employees. We've all been there actually. These are very confusing times, aren't they? They receive messages from management awaiting, doesn't it? And TSSA did, and we had a high response, a very positive response from TSSA members. That was not the case with RMT. We'd hoped that RMT would support the deal. They weren't able to support the deal. In fact, they recommended to members to vote no.
Supplementaries on this point before we turn to Mike and Gavin.
Well, I was just wondering about the additional costs, particularly on strike days, of accommodating people in hotels. We heard from the earlier panel of supplementary sums that were being paid to replace them.
I don't have an estimate of the cost, but obviously the reason why we do that is to try and provide a service for customers on these strike days. So there is a cost for that, but there's also an even bigger cost if we weren't to do that, and the lost revenue that we would see. So it's really important that we try and provide as many services, albeit limited, as we can by using these staff to come out and do these additional duties.
Yeah. And these would often presumably be managers who had previously done these roles in the past.
Predominantly, yes. Yeah.
And you're very confident about the safety aspect there of using managers and others in these positions.
Yeah, on those individuals have to be trained to a certain standard, and then on the day we put additional people out to monitor it to make sure that the people are doing what they're meant to do. Because obviously we have to work with the Office of the Rail Regulator to make sure that we've got a sensible and safe method of operation during strike days.
I mean, I'd just like to build on that as well, because the comment was made there that we would with no circumstance in which we'd allow that to happen. Absolutely sure through assessment and independent validation that our managers that are working in those sweeper boxes are competent. They've done a super job. But building on that, what I would say is that because they've protected sort of critical national infrastructure, the supplies of freight to power stations, some of the critical concern around how freight would be impacted. Okay.
And those safety incidents would all be documented.
Absolutely.
Yes, and I'm just thinking back to Friday. It was a non-strike day when I travelled. There was only 2 trains in the northeast running. And the one I got was 2.5 hours late. Thank you.
We investigate any incident that occurs, which is investigated the same on a strike day as a non-strike day, independently reviewed, and of course the objective is always to understand why, so we can help people improve. And again, that's the same whether there's a strike or not.
Thank you. Now I want to turn to the role of the government. Mike and then Gavin have some questions on that. Mike.
Yes, I mean this is to you both, and I'll start with Tim. First, hello as well, hello to you both. Has the new Secretary of State and Rail Minister taken a different approach to their predecessors in terms of negotiations, or are they still throwing a spanner in the works?
Well, Network Rail's in a slightly different position than the train companies. The changes that we want to make, in this case maintenance particularly, is the area where it was important to save money, to improve the reliability of the railway as well through the use of technology, meaning we need less people, which was, undoubtedly one of the things at the beginning of the dispute the RMT were concerned about particularly. So we made the business case. We demonstrated to government that by reducing 1,850 members of staff, that would provide, allow us to achieve the savings we needed to make, and would provide a package for pay. So we asked government support and approval to make that, quite obviously insofar as the fact that the current Secretary of State and the current Rail Minister have met on a number of occasions with the trade unions directly. That didn't occur before. But that didn't help me resolve the disputes with the TSSA.
A similar response. I think the fact that the ministers have met with the trade unions, the general secretaries of the trade unions, the employer and the trade unions, to go away and try to understand the areas of differences. First of all, it's of the financials of that. What I alluded to earlier on is we don't know the final number.
Moving on slightly, well documented, in fact, on the floor of the House yesterday, we had the statement in terms of the draconian legislation to effectively, or try to ban strikes. That's what it is, known as the minimum service levels of agreement. Now, the previous bill, the previous impact assessment, lead to further industrial strife, further industrial action. What's your assessment? I'll take it with you Steve, first.
Until I see the legislation, I have not seen the detail of it, and we've not been privy to what it will really mean in terms of, is it 30%, 40%, 50% minimum service levels. So we have not seen that detail. So when the legislation, if the legislation goes through, we will then work with that once we understand it. But at the moment, we don't have any other insight than what's been announced.
Same position, actually, yes. I mean, there is a difference between how a minimum than a train, because the signal box is either open or shut. It's binary, whereas trains, you can have more or fewer of them. So we need to understand how legislation would apply in those types of circumstances, and we haven't seen the detail yet to be able to do that.
Run a safe railway with this form of provision in place and curtailing the right for employees to withdraw their labour?
We would only ever operate a safe rail. If it's not safe, we won't do it. What I can say is that in previous experience, much earlier in my career when I used to work for Eurostar, I saw on a number of occasions in France how, not through legislation, but through the way the trade unions are structured differently, how very frequently when there were industrial action in France, some train service would run, but not all of it, depending on which trade unions were at work and which were not. That was quite a frequent, I have to say, event at that particular time back in the 90s. So I think perhaps caused by a different thing, but nevertheless the effect was the same, which was that some trains ran and other trains didn't. I've no reason to see why that in itself creates an issue of safety.
Have you had any discussions with ministers about this?
I've not been involved in any discussions with ministers, no.
No.
No discussions whatsoever?
They've talked to us that there was legislation coming, but not in the detail of it in any way at all, no.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thanks very much, Chair. I have a number of questions here, but I realise I'll trample over my colleague's question at 15, so I will refrain and keep my questions fairly tight. If I could start just briefly on this point, just for clarity, Mr Montgomery, in terms of obviously the industrial action over the past, the cost essentially of these strikes?
So the contracts are set out obviously over the year, depending what contract you're on, whether it's a national rail contract or emergency measures agreement. So you're measured over the year. You're giving a small percentage to operate the service, and then there's performance fees. On the days that are strikes, then you would exclude that. They would be excluded from the performance days. But then you're still measured over the other 300 and X days that are at the end of the year to evaluate how you've delivered.
Okay, and I suppose could you, a rough percentage then?
Of the cost of it in terms of the staff salaries, in terms of the loss of revenue, that all sits with government now. When we moved obviously from the franchising arrangements into the emergency measures agreement and now NRCs, all the risk of cost and revenue sits with government now.
That was my understanding, but thanks for putting that on the record. Can I ask this from a talk or RDG perspective? You may have heard me ask the previous panel. What's your take on the difference in approach to negotiations and disputes from the Scottish Government or indeed other devolved administrations and UK Government?
Again, I'm not involved in discussions with these other government bodies. I don't.
With the rest of resources?
I don't know what ScotRail's track access's charges are, I'll be perfectly honest with you. That's a matter for Scottish Government. And with Network Rail, I, as the chair of RDG do not get involved in that element of it.
I'm not playing poker with you, Mr. Montgomery yet. But I suppose this last question for Mr. Shoveler, it was the point was made in the last session about the service that is offered on strike days and in the days in between strike days, whereby the network out with the South East, very, very poor service. So if you look at Scotland and the northern regions and what have you, very poorly served compared to other parts.
To how each area is going to be served has been driven by a number of things, and I've talked about critical freight routes, for example. I've talked about making sure that for every manager that we have, they can control the largest possible area of the most critical infrastructure. So obviously, you have the key route between London and Scotland and into Glasgow. That's not a matter for Network Rail overall. That's been locally decided the same, whereas in my region, I've decided how best to use my competent managers to protect the things that are most important. Typically, the things that have weighted on that for me, as I said, have been critical national freight that has to be moved, and then where we're opening passenger lines, how we can move the largest number of passengers. More modern signalling installations, for example, one person can control many, many miles of track because the signalling runs largely automatically and it's supervised. Whereas, of course, in more rural locations, typically, sometimes, it requires one person to perhaps just do 5 miles of track and physically move points and move signals. So on that basis, it's far, you're going to open a much smaller part of the railway if you deploy your managers to those locations. So it's all been led by what's the right thing for freight and what's the right thing for our passengers.
Okay, I'm very conscious of time. Cheers.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Chair. Just to build on my colleague's comments there, I mean, if you look in the northeast, we've seen some massive disruption, and then when Network Rail strike went on last week, my constituents were left without a single train service. Why is it that strikes in Network Rail have shut down local rail services in the northeast, but haven't done so elsewhere? Why is it as dramatic as that?
Okay, and obviously we apologise to all the passengers that were inconvenienced by that. But I don't think there is a difference. The situation you described in the northeast, in some parts of Scotland, in my area, in the northwest, in the south, it's exactly the same. The focus has been on moving the largest number, offering service to the largest number of people and the largest number of freight companies, and that typically means the main lines stay open, but the secondary route, the number of signallers that's required to operate each section of route is much, much higher.
It should be about the criticality of the user as opposed to the volume that you're putting through. But we're conscious of time as well, so I'll push on. So I've got a little bit of a similar comment to Steve in terms of, they were going to shut Sunderland station down completely, and then they had a local outcry, and all of a sudden it got changed. Surely you should be in the best place in the first place. You shouldn't need local kickback to get to that situation.
Yeah, I think as Tim alluded to, it's how do we try and serve the masses, and that is very, very difficult, and there's a lot of decisions have to be made. Again, it's what infrastructure can be made available. It is difficult to balance it. I do know that Network Rail have done a huge amount of work to try and get as many signal boxes and continue every strike day to enhance the service. And it's just where do we prioritise, and what
where we are now.
No, I think the mandate that we have is the one that I asked for, is the one that I can afford. As I've explained, we funded this deal through efficiencies. I can't ask for a mandate that I can't afford to pay.
So you don't recognise government interference as deliberately trying to frustrate the deal, which was the implication from the first session?
It's not been an issue from that I've had visibility of.
Steve?
So I have received a further mandate, which will be used tomorrow. That is something that I can't talk about. So I think, again, as Tim's reform, that we can then put forward a sensible proposal, which obviously ultimately government do sign off and give us the mandate. So, but we have got a revised mandate for this week for TSSA and RMT.
Yeah, I could talk for a while, Chair.
Thank you. Jack, you want a very quick supplement?
Yeah, thank you, Chair.
It's our intention that hopefully there won't.
Are either of you aware of any other country in Europe that's now suffered 8 months?
you know, I think the thing that we're clear on is we needed to save some money. It was clear that the
Again, you know, just let's be fair, Scotland did suffer a large number of strike days before it was resolved as well, you know, so it's not been a simple process. What we've got to do is, how do we make this railway, to protect it for the future, how do we economically protect it? By making sure that we work together with the trade unions. That's a really important thing, is we work with the trade unions to try and secure the long-term future of the industry and the employees within the industry. And that's where we're trying to move towards at this moment in time.
Why do you think that this...
With the trade unions, it takes both teams to operate together to try and get to a solution. You know, whether it's UK government or whatever government, we have to deal with what we've got in front of us at this moment in time. We are working with the trade unions to try and get a resolvement in this, but it does take both sides. We cannot, you know, and we have to ensure that we can continue to make sure that the railway is sustainable for the future, deal sustainable for customers for the future as well as everybody else.
Can you put a figure on how much the government will have to reimburse you for losses on strike days?
We don't receive any payment for losses on strike days.
For the you
it varies. I don't have the exact figure for you. But
the total, you have no idea what the total
I've got a very kind of headline figure. I couldn't give you an exact figure.
I think one of the unions wrote to us suggesting it was 318 million so far.
Over all the strike days, that number will be quite high. Yeah, it'll be in that region, 300 to 500. We would.
That's quite a sizable amount of money that might have gone to help resolve this dispute in terms of offering the workers a better deal, isn't it?
I mean, lost revenue isn't the same as increased costs, obviously. So, and it's a tragedy to lose the revenue, but of course that's money that hasn't come into the industry, whereas obviously the increase.
But the money that the taxpayer is having to fork out because of the government.
Back to the situation of where we started to achieve that savings within the cost numbers